Hi, my name is Justin Laney and I'm General Manager of Fleet for John Lewis Partnership. We have a fleet of about 5,500 vehicles. That's about 4,500 commercial vehicles of all sizes, from the smallest van right up to 44-ton trucks pulling double-deck trailers, and about 1,000 cars. We've made two big commitments about decarbonising our fleet. One of them is that we'll have moved completely away from fossil fuel by 2030, and the other one is that we'll be net zero by 2035. And we're going to be doing that by transitioning all of our heavy trucks to be running on biomethane. For everything else, so that's vans, light trucks and cars, there'll be EVs by 2030. And there are a few remaining niches, for example, probably yard shunters. We even have a combine harvester on our farm. So those will be running on HVO biodiesel. So what does that actually do for us? Well, we save about 500,000 tonnes of CO2 between 2020 and 2030, mainly on the back of biomethane. And that's about an 80% reduction versus sort of business as usual diesel. And in fact, now our carbon emissions are roughly half of what they were in 2018. But it's also revenue saving, and that's really important. So everything we do has a business case and saves revenue overall. And the other thing that's not actually factored into this is we also expect lower maintenance cost of EVs versus their diesel equivalents. One of the key things of running any transport operation is to be as efficient as you possibly can. And that's particularly true of alternative fuels. For EVs then, that means minimizing the energy requirement by making vehicles as light as possible, influencing driving style as much as you can, and minimizing, for example, the load of fridges on vehicles. That means you can then have the smallest practical battery, which means you have a lower cost vehicle, and it means you need less charging and a bit more payload. That in turn means that your charging strategy is more likely to be slow overnight charging, and that needs to be combined with smart scheduling and smart charging, so you can really maximize the time available to get the energy into vehicles. And of course, by minimizing energy requirement and spreading it as much as you can, doing it as smart as you can, you minimize the need for grid upgrades. Another really key thing is to maximize productivity. And that means by matching charging to downtime. And that's a real challenge, for example, in heavy-duty trucks, because if a tractor like the one on the bottom here requires several hours to be charged, and yet it's only available to charge for 2 or 3 hours in a day, that means that you might need to buy more trucks in order to do the same work. And likewise, if drivers have got to wait a long time while they're out on the road for trucks to charge. So matching charging to downtime to maintain productivity is really important. Another one for any operation, I think, is to minimize on-road charging, for that reason about not having the driver waiting around for a vehicle to charge up. And also yard management is really key here. So making sure that people know where to park a vehicle, what charger is it parked on, so that you can kind of minimize lost time in the yard, and also make sure that every vehicle is charged up to the right level in time for departure in the morning. Making batteries last as long as possible is another really important factor about making the business case for EVs work. And I'll come back at the end of the slide about why there's UPS vans there. And that means slow charging wherever possible, because that is much better for the battery. It also means only charging to the required level. So if we don't need to charge to 100%, important that we don't. And a big part of charging strategy ought to be around not having to either fully discharge batteries or charge them up to 100% every day. And finally, there's a point of kind of V2X or V2 grid. So if we're using energy in the battery to power other things or selling it back to the grid, that means more cycles on the battery, and that might have an effect on battery life. And important that that's understood when we're factoring in the effects of things like a vehicle to grid in the overall economics. And the reason the UPS truck is here is that you can make vehicles last a very, very long time if they're designed from the outset for a long life. And if you're designing an EV in that way, and you can make the battery last a very long time, that might be the clue to unlocking a business case that works versus one that doesn't. Because very often, if you simply replace a diesel vehicle with an electric one, certainly a commercial vehicle, the business case won't work. So you need to look for these other ways of making the business case work. So where the energy comes from is really important. And again, this applies to all alternative fuels. We want to make sure that that energy is properly sustainable. In the case of EVs, even if you're on a green tariff, then you need to think about the implications of charging. For example, if you convert a fleet of diesel vans to EVs and you charge them up at peak times, then there's a very good chance that the true carbon intensity of the energy is much higher than at other times. So the more you can do off-peak charging, the better, but important to understand that element of it. It might be as well that you need long-term supply agreements in order to give you price confidence. So, power purchase agreements, that kind of thing, to ensure that you can source clean energy over the long term. And ideally, you've got a good idea on what that price is going to be to protect you from the kind of volatility, the volatility that we've seen in energy pricing over the last couple of years. Resilience is another really key area. Timing for one thing, so ensuring that infrastructure is in place in time for vehicles, and that sounds obvious, but it's not always easy because very often infrastructure projects will be delayed because of planning or lack of the right spare parts or just general supplier lead times. And likewise, vehicles are affected by some of the same factors. So really important that happens. Absolutely vital, of course, the infrastructure arrives before vehicles. So planning for that, making sure it happens, and planning for what you do if it doesn't happen is absolutely key. Another point is that you often have a single point of failure. So in that, if you're relying on a charging system to charge a depot of a number of vehicles, and that fails, you've got a real problem. So certainly built-in redundancy is absolutely vital. So the key components might be doubled up, or there's a kind of backup system if there is a failure. And also planning for that failure is really key, because you don't want to be doing that on the day. And finally, energy supplies. Resilience of supply, knowing that you might have capacity for the site right now, but what happens in a few years' time if things change? If you install heat pumps, for example, then does that rob you of the capacity that you need for your vehicles, and potentially if you've got a long lead time for grid upgrades. And of course, there are many challenges around property. So that might be planning lead times, because certainly for things like charging parks, but also sometimes, for just kind of redevelopment to enable EV, the planning system doesn't really allow for moving quickly on that, and that's a real challenge for infrastructure providers. Also, of course, you need landlord consent if you're installing chargers or other infrastructure into a building, and that's not always forthcoming. So again, really important to look into that, understand the issues. And often that'll be, if a lease on a building is coming up for renewal within 1 or 2 years, you'll probably stay, but you're not absolutely sure. Then making those decisions about what infrastructure you install and when, and also possibly designing infrastructure to be relocated. I think that's two really important things. And finally, fire safety. Particularly parking EVs underground, as in this example here. There might be implications for, again, landlord consent, but also possibly for for sprinkler systems and so on. And then another really important thing is to have software that enables you to properly manage both the fleet and the infrastructure. So software like this is the system that we use from Flexible Power Systems. It's been developed with us and with others. But you want visibility of where vehicles are, what the state of charge is, and are they going to have a problem in completing their route. So you want alerts for that kind of thing. You also want alerts for chargers that might be down. You want to be able to allocate vehicles in situations such as the ones where most of our vehicles going out operate 2 routes in a day with 2 different drivers. So allocating the second route on the basis of the expected charge when the vehicle returns back to base and how much charge it will need for the second route is really key. You also want the software to set charging levels so that, going back to a point earlier, not every vehicle is charged up to the full extent. They're simply charged to the level that they'll need for the following day. And finally, load management. So that's making sure that the limits on site capacity aren't breached, but also having that ability to be able to turn off other loads on the site in order to prioritise vehicle charging is really important. So in summary then, and you'll see from this picture that we've been operating electric vehicles for quite a number of years now. I think one of the key things is to take an holistic view of an entire site. What's the operation? What are the energy loads? How can we spread the charging load, and so on? And then to prioritise efficiency and productivity, resilience, and battery life. Thank you very much for listening.